Good afternoon, this is Arthur Katarai, Senior Partner of A2K Advisory. This is the second episode of the Right Advice podcast, and today we're having the CEO of Standard Bank in DRC, Mr. Amedeo Anniciello. Thank you for having us, Mr. Anniciello.
Good afternoon, and very nice to meet you. Thank you.
Well, Standard Bank is the biggest bank in Africa. The biggest corporate bank in the DRC. It's been 160 years that you guys are in existence, 30 years in the DRC. Obviously, you financed a lot of projects in the mining sector, the natural resource sector, in DRC, but also in Africa, generally speaking. I'm going to start with your background, because you're of Italian origin, you were born in South Africa. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, and in regards to your interest in banking as well, how it started?
Great, thanks very much. So yes, I'm Italian of origin. I was born in Johannesburg and grew up there. Did all my schooling in Johannesburg, and then went to college. At college I did a diploma in financial management and a diploma in international financial management. And then I studied law as well during that process. Once I had graduated, I then looked and saw what are the different opportunities in the market, and sat down with my dad and said, well, where do I go from here? And at that point I had received 3 different job offers. One was to go to a law firm to go and do articles, but I had to spend 5 years doing articles, and I said, no, I'm too young to be locked away for 5 years pushing a pen around. The other was in a company that was listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, who wanted a law officer, and I thought that was quite an interesting proposal. And the third one was with Société Générale, the French banking group, who had a small presence in Johannesburg at the time. And I decided to go into banking, with a view to say, well, once I get into banking, I'm sure that many different business opportunities will arise, and I will see what would be the best for me from a banking perspective, or from a career perspective, having the banking experience. I started off in risk, specifically credit risk, and then grew up through the ranks. And after about 5 or 6 years, I was the head of risk for Société in Johannesburg, and was offered an opportunity to transfer from Johannesburg to Cape Town, to go and transform the office there and to rebuild the office that we had in Cape Town. So that was quite an interesting move, coming from the risk background to go into the business background. So 38 years later, here I am, and still in banking, waiting to decide what it is that I want to do.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, it's a very good combination, law and banking, because obviously those are 2 categories that regulate our lives, daily lives, in regards to what we do, generally speaking.
Absolutely. And I think if you look at over the years, and especially since 2007, 2008 financial crisis, there is a much higher level of compliance and governance that is imposed on banks, in terms of making sure that regulations are followed, and that the processes that the banks use are a lot more aligned with regulatory and are not taking chances on different market environments. So I think certainly since 2007 and 8, that crisis, banks are far more regulated. They're far more strict in their approach to how they manage their businesses. And I think it's become a less risky environment. But we're in the business of risk. So it's a question of how do you mitigate those risks, how do you manage those risks in order to ensure that you're able to perform the business as well as and efficiently as you can, providing returns to your shareholders and keeping your depositor money safe.
Most definitely. And in regards to that same professional experience that you've had, you've worked in many African countries. From what I can remember, Gabon, Algeria, Zambia, South Africa.
So
obviously.
This is now the 6th country in Africa that I've worked in, if you include South Africa.
Okay.
So from South Africa, I was transferred to Gabon with Citibank at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I spent 15 and a half years with Citibank. Initially, I was part of the team that opened the office for Citibank in Cape Town.
Okay.
As I say, I transferred to Gabon, spent 2.5 years in Gabon. Then I went to Zambia for 3 years. Then from Zambia to Algeria for 3.5 years. Algeria to Ghana, Ghana to DRC.
Well, it's fascinating.
And interestingly enough, in each of those cases, it was at a particularly difficult time in the history of those countries.
Okay.
So.
And what have you drawn as a conclusion in regards to this experience in each of those experiences in those particular countries?
So looking back on my career over the last 38 years, I think a lot of my time has been spent on restructuring, reorganizing, refreshing businesses and particular branches to make sure that they become viable, contributing enterprises. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what I've been asked to do.
And how have you managed the in-country cultures and realities that are different from one country to another?
So fortunately, having been born in South Africa, mm-hmm. I consider myself to be an African. And working with different cultures, ethnicities, ideologies, political environments, languages, even religions in some cases. Mm-hmm. You learn to adapt in each of those markets. And that's, I think, been one of the fortes, is being very adaptable and learning quickly to understand those markets, who the people are, what are their requirements, okay. And how do we integrate the business with the local environment.
Oh, very interesting. So from Citibank, and then you came to Standard Bank. It's a very interesting transition.
So I was with in Ghana. I was with Fidelity Bank for a year. Okay. So that was a short sojourn between the two, mm-hmm. And then from Fidelity I joined Standard Bank, mm-hmm. where I've been for almost the last 5 years.
Okay. And obviously Standard is the biggest bank in Africa, and it had since 2007, I believe, with ICBC. Which is the biggest bank in the world, the Chinese bank. You've had a partnership in which...
So the ICBC acquired 20% of Standard Bank. Okay. And it's now a very strong relationship that we have together with the Chinese. Mm-hmm. And from their perspective, we are the primary corridor for Chinese business and investment into Africa, mm-hmm. and also from Africa back to China. Okay. So being the biggest partners together in our respective markets, mm-hmm. We have a very strong relationship together, and we provide very strong synergies.
Okay. And that gives you almost a limited, financial power to finance the appropriate project that you deemed.
I wouldn't go as far as to say it's unlimited, mm-hmm. Because everything has to be managed and measured according to the requirements.
Of course.
In a lot of cases, we partner with other banks in local markets. We do syndications, we do club deals, mm-hmm. we do various transactions where we're not the sole banker to that transaction.
Mm-hmm. As you know, DRC has many extraordinary assets in regards to natural resources, but there has been a lack of liaison between the assets and the capital available for many projects to get going. How is that possible to be able to liaise those two in an environment that is complicated in many instances? And I've had the thoughts to be sometimes naive in thinking that because the assets are there and because the capital is there, usually there shouldn't be any issues to get project going. But the business climate makes it that sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than that. From your perspectives in different countries.
No, absolutely, and I think you look look across all of the different countries, all of Africa, and the risk profile from an economic risk or political risk or sovereign risk, each one of them has their own particular nuance. If we look at the DRC is blessed to have $24 trillion of mining resources or mineral resources in the ground.
Sorry.
And where you say that there's capital available, people also look at the risk at deploying that capital in a particular market. What is the risk that I put my money into that country but I'm not able to repatriate that capital in due course? How am I going to get my investment returns out of that country? So investors take a very close look at each of the different countries. And in making that decision to invest capital, there has to be a very high level of certainty
Most definitely.
that I'm going to be able to get the capital back plus the return on that investment.
For sure.
So capital is available globally. DRC, like other countries across Africa, have had its political risks, has had its economic risks. And in the mining sector, people have been more optimistic in terms of the mining investments.
Okay.
Outside of that, it's been a little bit more restricted. We've seen some of the big multinational corporations that have exited the DRC. And if one goes back a little bit in history, at the time of independence, DRC was the second most industrialized country in Africa after South Africa.
That's correct.
So the probability or the propensity for DRC to get back to that exists. It's now going to be a question of, well, how do we resolve the political risk?
Okay.
How do we manage the economic risk? And how do we make sure that the country promotes itself to continue on that forward trajectory to achieve those objectives? Now, I think that President Tshisekedi has done a reasonably good job in addressing things like corruption and trying to put the country on a much more positive footing. There's been support from the IMF, the World Bank, various of the embassies are providing a lot of support to the local government, and I think that's good. Now it's a question of, we had the elections a couple of years ago. The next set of elections is at the end of 2023.
That's right.
The country is in the process of preparing for those elections, and it's absolutely critical that the country goes forward to have free, fair, transparent, bloodless, non-violent elections which are accepted globally, whatever the outcome, and that the country then continues on a positive momentum going forward.
For sure, I agree 100%. And in regards to going back to mining, what are the specifications on the project that you usually finance? Would they be artisanal, industrial, or semi-artisanal?
So we focus primarily on big industrial mining corporations,
Okay.
so some of the majors. We don't get involved in any artisanal mining. That's not our business model.
Okay.
I think
Semi-industrial?
we support the mining companies and the ecosystem of those mining companies.
Okay.
So suppliers to the mines are potential clients of the bank. So we look at that as well. In terms of artisanal mining, we know that the government are in the process of trying to put better controls and regulations around artisanal mining. And I think once that is in place, then potential projects around that may become more attractive from a Standard Bank perspective.
The demand for copper and cobalt is going to quadruple between now and 2050. It's also going to double from between now and 2030. So many mining projects related to copper and cobalt need to go online to be able to absorb the demand for that particular metal, especially when you take into consideration the electric vehicle demand that's going to go, that's going to skyrocket, and obviously everything that's related to to computers, phones that use cobalt and copper. How do you see, all this demand with the global energy transition that is currently taking place, and the will for the world economy to shift from fossil fuels to an economy that is supposed to be greener than it actually is currently.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think if one looks at the last 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, because of the higher demand for copper and cobalt, some of the mines that had been in care and maintenance have come back into full production. And that has ramped up the output. So that I think is critical. We've also seen one of the very big mines that has come online. Its yields are very good and its production is very high. So from that perspective, we see continued growth in the mining industry. We're also starting to see that some of the big mining companies are starting to reconsider coming back into the DRC, having exited previously, and we think that there are some significant opportunities there. Demand for copper will continue to grow because populations around the world are continuing to grow, and as the emerging middle classes continue to have higher demands for all sorts of things, whether it's fridges or air conditioners or copper piping for water and so on, demand for copper will continue to grow as it has been. For cobalt, I think it's been a similar sort of story, and you talk about, electrification of motor cars, computers and so on. As the world becomes more digitized, there will continue to be a growth from that perspective. Where I see a challenge with cobalt maybe is that in the future there may be new technologies that will replace cobalt as a resource.
So it's already the case. I mean, it's under study.
Correct.
Currently.
So will Tesla continue to have the demand on cobalt for its batteries in the future? We know that there will be a strong demand for the next 20 years. But post that, what then? And we know that some of the new mines take 5-6 years before they become productive, and then it's a 20-year capacity after that. So I think a lot of opportunity. I think there's a lot of opportunity in mining. And I think, from a DRC perspective, it's blessed with not only copper and cobalt, it's got gold, diamonds, tin, and many other different resources which are in high demand and which have high prices now. The question is, well, how do you manage the risk associated with mining in some of the areas where those resources are, and especially along the eastern frontier of the Congo, where we know that there are a number of challenges.
Most definitely. As we all know, private companies try to stay as far away from politics as possible, because you're there to make profit. You're there to be able to having a positive impact in the communities that you are operating in. But we see today that there is this situation that it's hard to get away from what's going on in the world. We have the situation in Russia, which is a political situation, but when we look at the economic situation, it seems that there is going to be less access to Russian oil and gas. We see the situation in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, those countries want to shift away from the economy that is solely based on oil. That obviously is going to accelerate the energy transition. How can a country like the DRC can position itself within this whole economic, political changes that are happening currently, and that's going to have an impact on different economies, especially African economies?
So I think from a DRC perspective, it's important that the political transition here continues on a positive trajectory, as I said earlier, because it's only with political certainty that you will get capital investment. The political certainty also then brings stability. With that stability, you get economic growth and stability. Those are the drivers that will certainly empower the country to move forward into the future. They have the resources. For me, I think where some of the biggest opportunities exist is to do beneficiation of some of those resources in country, rather than exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. How do we go back to a point in time when Peugeot and Ford and General Motors had plants in this country, when Nestle and Unilever had plants manufacturing in this country? Those are the things that the country should be focusing on in terms of doing local beneficiation. We have 7 million hectares of irrigated arable land in the country. How do we ensure that the produce from that arable land gets to market, whether it's for domestic consumption or for international export? If we don't have the infrastructure to be able to get those goods to market, then they go, they sit on the farm and they go bad. So important that we know that populations are growing. How do we make sure that from a DRC perspective, the potential to use that arable land efficiently and transform that output into benefit or beneficiation for the country is critical?
Okay, I see. For sure, it's a lot to take and a lot to do in that regard to create a business climate that is appropriate for investors to put their capital in.
No, absolutely, and if I look,
and there's no way around that.
Absolutely, and if I look at the 5 years that I've been in the DRC, in that short time, I see already some transition. I've seen how people have started to change some of their ideology, some of their philosophy, some of the archaic mentality that says that DRC is a high-risk country, we can't go there, to saying DRC is a high-risk country, how do we invest there and achieve our objectives? And I think for me that is important. And certainly from our perspective at Standard Bank, as we do across the continent, we say that Africa is our home, we drive her growth. And our philosophy for the DRC is the same. How do we drive the growth in the DRC?
Okay. That's a very good way to think about it. The show is called The Right Advices. What would be your advice to an individual or an enterprise to be able to thrive in the DRC in an environment that is, in many instances, complicated? Access to capital for a small enterprise or even for a big enterprise or for an individual is not easy, or at least not as easy as you can see in North America or Europe. How do you bridge that gap of difficulty between the ambition that you have and the goal that you want to reach?
So I think firstly I wouldn't be giving advice to anybody. I'm not an advisor, I'm a banker. My viewpoint is that coming into this country, one needs to be aware of what the challenges are. And we know that it's a country that has very high regulatory controls and so on. In coming into the country, make sure that you follow the regulations to the spirit and letter of the law. Because if you try and breach that, you're going to fall foul of regulation and you will get into trouble. So be mindful and respectful of the Congolese. They are the people that own and run the country. Incorporate them into your business and make sure that in terms of driving your own business strategy, that it's you clearly understand what the end objective is and don't get involved in any mischievous behavior.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Anniciello. We wish Standard Bank the best in DRC. I know this is your 30-year anniversary this year.
That's correct, yeah.
So I'm sure you're going to be here for the next 30, 50 years and so on.
And there's no reason why not. I mean, we've been here 30 years. The group has been around for almost 160 years. And certainly our ambition is to continue to grow with this market.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you very much and all the best to Standard Bank.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.